Welcome back to the Athenaeum Book Club podcast. You can find out more about the Athenaeum Book Club over at athenaeumbooks.com. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate. You can find me on X and all social platforms. I'm at Jeremy Ryan Slate everywhere. And I'm very excited about the conversation we're going to have today because I know recently we've covered Utopia by St. Thomas More, and I could think of nothing better than a follow-up about St. Augustine, which I thought would be really great and a lot of you have asked for. So we're going to be covering the Confessions of St. Augustine today. And we have Dr. Matthew Knotts with us today. So Matthew, thank you for hanging out with me today, sir.
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
So Dr. Knotts, could you start by introducing yourself a little bit and also first how you encountered the work of St. Augustine? I know you've also written extensively even on how to read Augustine as well. So if you could tell us a little bit about the background and what drew you to study it.
Certainly. I currently teach at a high school north of Chicago. I completed my PhD on Augustine at the University of Leuven in Belgium. And that was in theology. Before that, I studied philosophy at the University of St. Andrews in the United Kingdom. So I would say my methodology has always bridged, let's say, multiple gaps between the philosophical, the theological, the historical, among others. So I'm particularly interested in Augustine's theory of knowledge, introspection, how he explores the contours of the soul, so to speak. My recent book deals extensively with the Confessions, and I'll say more about that, of course, in a moment, especially the psychological aspects of it, how Augustine is really uh, not just engaging with himself as an individual, but also what it means to be human and the sorts of limits and paradoxes that he discovers therein. This research, I would say, really has its roots extending really to my days as an undergraduate. I, at the suggestion of a professor, started reading the Confessions in my spare time. And interestingly, when I first started reading it, it took me a little while to get into it, so to speak. I'm sure all of us have those experiences with books. Sometimes it takes us a while to warm to them. And that was my experience with the Confessions. And I was actually at the point of just giving up on it. And then there was this one line that really impressed me. And it goes something like this: every unjust soul is its own punishment.
Mm.
In other words, we do not, as it were, get punished. There's that image that we do something bad and God punishes us and such, but he's reflecting on the vices of the soul and how the things that we do hurt us intrinsically, as a result of our own actions. And that was the hook, let's say, that really brought me into it. The intensity of it really appeals to me. The literary quality. Sometimes people describe it as a poem in prose. So that I found really fascinating. Moving through some of the aspects of his life and how he interprets or even reinterprets some aspects of that, I found really fascinating. Later, as I started to become more of a researcher, I really found it interesting how he explores perennial philosophical questions. Question Time, most famously, Book 11. I suppose if anyone has studied philosophy, especially classical or medieval philosophy, Book 11 is one of those books that they would likely read when discussing the question of time, and how he also comes at the intersection of the classical world, the dawn of the medieval world, how he really sets the stage for that. So I've always found the Confessions, even though I've looked at other aspects of Augustine, I've always found that really fascinating, and I suppose I've returned to it time and time again, especially in this recent monograph of mine.
So I guess for listeners who might not be familiar with the text, it might be new to them. Could you give us kind of an overview, just a high level overview of what the Confession's about? And at the same time, how does this differ from other typical autobiographies?
Certainly. The Confessions was composed roughly between 397 and 400. And to give a very brief biographical note on Augustine, this was the point at which he had just become a bishop. About 10 years before, he had undergone this radical conversion. He had resigned as a professor. He had decided initially to become something like a monk, living in community, reading philosophy, reading the scriptures. Things turned out differently for him. So after he has gone through this consecration, he is now reflecting on, especially the last 10 years of his life, which has really witnessed this radical transformation. The immediate, let's say, impetus for it was from a wealthy man named Paulinus of Nola, who asked him, what happened? How did you come to this point in your life? Augustine was he was relatively well known in the classical world. So essentially, some of it was a question. The Confessions is structured in 13 books, chapters, if you will. The first 9, one could call them biographical or autobiographical to some degree, and I'll return to that in a moment. They conclude around the time, shortly after the time of his conversion, when his mother Monica dies. The next book, book 10, involves his life at the time of his writing, and then books 11 through 13 are an allegorical reading of the book of Genesis, especially creation, which was very common in early Christianity, and also, I think, very important for Augustine's overall theology. Scholars have attempted to determine a particular order or structure to the confessions, and that is relatively inconclusive. What we can say is that there are 3 major themes that are present in it. One of them is let's say, the distance of the soul from God, how sin alienates and separates us from God. Second, I would say, is how God calls the soul back to him. And that exercise is mainly one of grace, of God's self-gift. And thirdly, and this is very philosophical, Neoplatonic, Augustine calls for one to return within oneself and to find God located within. So, for instance, in one of the famous passages, he talks about how he was outside of himself. He was absorbed in things of the world, whether we want to talk about sense pleasures or interests in career, advancement, riches, esteem, etc., which he deems vain and ephemeral. And he says one should return within oneself. God is always within, waiting. Another point on confession is that the term, in Latin, confessio, or the verb confuteri, in our contemporary parlance, one generally thinks of confession as the confession of sin, or we think of it in a forensic context and someone has committed a crime.
Sure.
That's true. However, the sense of confession for Augustine is first and foremost a confession of praise, a confession of God's greatness, and certainly a confession of one's faults can follow from that. But it's first and foremost directed towards God. The very opening line of the confessions, which quotes from the Psalms, is, Lord, you are great. Lord, you are worthy of praise. So then to your point about how it's different from a typical autobiography, people often look to the Confessions as perhaps the first autobiography in history. And it's true to say that there are some autobiographical elements to it. As I mentioned, the first 9 to 10 books, however you look at it, are definitely autobiographical in nature. I would identify at least 2 major challenges, however, to that view. One of them, and I suggested this a moment ago, is the fact that ultimately the Confessions is a prayer. The entire work is addressed to God. It's always in, primarily at least, the second person. So Augustine is having a conversation, a dialogue, if you will, with God, into which the reader is invited, and in which the reader can participate indirectly and then appropriate that, perhaps, for oneself. And secondly, this is where it gets very complex. Um, it's not to suggest that Augustine is mendacious, but one should always take the descriptions of the confessions with a pinch of salt. To some degree, he is recounting historical and autobiographical events. To some degree, however, he is reinterpreting his life, thinking about alternative possibilities, what perhaps he should have done or would have done. If one wanted to be a little bit more cynical, one could also suggest that he is using these episodes in his life as vehicles to argue for his doctrine of grace, for example. But in any case, the understanding of autobiography is very different now than it may be in his work. Certainly, it was
Sure.
revolutionary in many respects, but I think we always need to keep in mind that it's facing God. He's not simply engaged in introspection because he's writing a memoir. I think it's always first and foremost the story, yes, of his soul, but also of the human soul. And he is inviting people to appropriate that conversation that he has with God for themselves.
So let me ask you this, because the person interested in the Roman Empire in me has to ask. This isn't the late Roman period. The West is going to fall in 476, so not too long after this. I'm curious, what is the Roman world like at this point in time? Especially, he's in North Africa, so it is a little bit more disconnected as things in the provinces kind of change substantially in the later empire. What is the world he's living in like at this point in time?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Of course, this is post Constantine, so there's a growing separation between West and East. This is also post Nicaea, so Christianity is starting to take on a more robust institutional and doctrinal structure.
Hmm.
The area from which he came in North Africa was a relatively stable and economically prosperous area. So even though there was rising instability throughout, especially the western part of the empire, the place in which he resided was still relatively buffered from those challenges. However, that did change eventually, especially after the sack of Rome in 411. Many people moved across the Mediterranean. This created certainly demographic challenges. But one of the challenges it created was that all of a sudden there was an influx of Arian Christians. And of course, that would involve Arius and the Council of Nicaea, which created a new pastoral and theological challenge. Within North Africa itself, it was uh, largely Christian, by that time, largely Romanized. However, with Augustine himself and within his environment, there were, let's say, two currents. There was, of course, the Roman current, and his father was Roman. His mother was Berber, North African. And he found himself uh, inhabiting both cultures and was proud of both cultures. One of the reasons I mention that is because the reception of Christianity within North Africa was also a rather fraught experience. There were factions, the Donatists, for example. There were also Manichaeans, and of course, he was a Manichaean for some time. So Christianity was somewhat conflicted itself. However, politically and economically speaking, there was relative stability as the rest of the Western Empire, as you know, was entering a downslide and some very difficult periods. Towards the end of his life, let's say in the 410s and onwards, that starts to move across the Mediterranean as Augustine reaches the end of his life in 430.
So when we look at Augustine's early life, a lot of it is marked with skepticism and a search for truth through various philosophies, as you mentioned, Manichaeism and skepticism. How do these shape his worldview before his conversion to Christianity?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and one which in many ways is still at the forefront of research. You mentioned Manichaeism. That is probably the most important formative influence in his early intellectual career. In 373, he encountered a work by Cicero called the Hortensius. This was a work which was more or less part of a broader tradition or genre in classical philosophy, a kind of exhortation to seek wisdom, to seek the good life, to to follow philosophy. And he became really inflamed with this desire for truth. And he sought that in various philosophical schools. I should also note he was raised in a, for lack of a better term, a loosely Christian household, by which I mean that his mother was deeply Christian, very devoted and pious, and he says a significant amount about that in the Confessions and elsewhere. His father, however, was not. His father was baptized on his deathbed, but his father was rather distant towards Christianity and even skeptical and mocking at some point. So Augustine had an orientation towards Christianity. He had an orientation towards wisdom. However, at an early stage of his life, he became enamored with Manichaeism, which, to put it in very simple terms, is a sort of dualistic religion related to Zoroastrianism, but with a Christian gloss on it.
Well,
So
that makes sense. The part of the world he's living in, right? Because he would have been dealing with what's left of the Persian Empire at this point in time. So it does make sense where he's at.
exactly, exactly. And what is called Manichaeism is, let's say, one gloss or variation on this much larger worldview. So he becomes really fascinated with that. And in a way, it seems like the intensity of it may have appealed to him in some ways, this sharp divide between body and soul, the importance of asceticism, at least ideally, the importance of asceticism. What also appealed to him was the promise of attaining wisdom or knowledge without any faith element. And he found this really compelling, and this really drew him in. He was also, when he was a student, he met other practitioners of Manichaeism, and so that social element also drew him in as well. One of the challenges he found with Manichaeism, however, was the fact that it perhaps did not deliver on all of its promises. It was also, from his perspective, rather hypocritical in some of its practices, and so eventually he became disenchanted with it. That being said, scholars tend to argue about whether and to what extent he really rejected Manichaeism. They would argue that in his doctrine of original sin, for example, there is a residual Manichaeism, especially in terms of the, let's say, intensity he feels about the sinfulness of the flesh. That's definitely present. So that was really an enormous formative influence on him and really occupied his life, and also really was upsetting to his mother, who was deeply Christian. You mentioned skepticism, and that's very interesting as well, and also very important because for decades, really, of Augustine research, that was not considered a particularly important part of his life. It was considered really a footnote. However, in the last 5 to 10 years or so, scholars have begun to examine that more carefully and suggest that perhaps skepticism plays more of a role, especially in the early Augustine, than we had tended to think. For example, the skeptics, in a basic sense, believed that we should be reticent to assent to anything that we cannot say is ultimately true. So there's a kind of continuous searching and a sort of, shall we say, openness to continuous growth.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be taken in a variety of ways, but I think one way in which it influenced Augustine is that if one takes the idea of a God who is eternal, ineffable, beyond our understanding, this idea, depending on how one interprets it, of skepticism could be received into Christianity in the sense that one is constantly searching for God. Yes, one can say meaningful things about him, but one must also continue to search.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very biblical. That's very Augustinian. One sees that in his life and his thought. And since we're talking about the Confessions, this is something that Charles Matthews noted in an article from about 25 years ago. The earliest manuscripts of the Confessions, and or well, let's put it this way, the later medieval manuscripts of the Confessions end with the word Amen. Earliest manuscripts do not, which
Interesting.
which suggests that the Amen was a later scribal addition. Perhaps that was in good faith, thinking someone missed something or it was an error. Perhaps it was an interpolation. They thought, well, we should really conclude this. It is a prayer after all. But the point that Matthews makes is to say that instead of presenting a closing, something that is definitely finished, Augustine's work is more open-ended. And the final word is aperiator, so it is opened, or it may be opened. That's if one ends with that word about opening, that creates this very different interpretation of the work as a whole. And so there's this claim that skepticism, in a sense, was perhaps more influential on Augustine, especially the early Augustine, than scholars may have otherwise thought.
So you mentioned his mother, Monica, and the effect that she had on him. I'm curious what effect she had on the work itself, and also what effect she had on his life and his belief system.
Yes, her influence cannot be overstated. I would say a few things of particular interest arise. I mentioned her, for lack of a better term, pious Christianity. In some of his earliest dialogues, for example, she appears. And he talks about this in the Confessions too, of course. She becomes a personification of a simple, unlearned faith, one that is not particularly sophisticated or educated in philosophy or theology, but one which has an access to wisdom because of its humility. And he takes that very seriously. He portrays Monica as this sage of Christianity. In fact, she's included in these early dialogues, which would have been unthinkable to have a woman included in a philosophical dialogue. That was very unconventional, to say the least. So his emphasis on her piety and the, let's say, intellectual implications of that, very important.
Mhm.
In addition, as he discusses in the Confessions, she was very emphatic. She was very persistent. She followed him across the sea. She was trying desperately to convert him to at least her understanding of Christianity. And I think
Sure.
one of the points that arises out of this is the way in which God pursues the soul. I mentioned grace, for example, before, and how God acts through his human agents in order to accomplish that. And he sees Monica as this person who is working on God's behalf to bring him back. The relationships of Augustine's life, whether it's friends or family, are really central. And I believe that for him, his mother is, let's say, that central force who really affects that transformation in him, and which would not have been possible were it not for her. So he really sees her essential to his conversion. He sees her as a model of Christian piety and faith. And obviously, in the Confessions, when she dies, he talks about how he mourned for her, the real difficulties he felt because of how much he missed her. So she's really central to his life. That cannot be overstated.
It's interesting for me, and because I know this goes earlier in time, and it's pre-Christian since it's a pagan situation, but it can't help me. It can't help but make me think of Marcus Aurelius and his mother, who actually was a huge reason that Stoicism became so important to him. So I think it is just an interesting comparison point of what effect a mother can have on someone's development.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So when we're looking at Augustine's time in Milan, so he spends time in Milan and he encounters Bishop Ambrose, and he also encounters the idea of Neoplatonism. And this seems pretty pivotal in his life. So when we look at this, how does the Christian intellectual scene influence him, and what would it have looked like in this time period?
Absolutely. Completely correct. Pivotal, crucial. I mentioned how he was a Manichae. Because of his connections with the Manichaees, he was able to rise in the uh, political and academic world, and that eventually brought him to Milan. He had a very prominent role. That being said, he had already begun to have doubts about Manichaeism, as I suggested before. In Milan, there was a very strong Neoplatonic presence, as you mentioned, and Ambrose was a major example of that. Augustine started to listen to Ambrose's homilies out of a kind of general curiosity. Augustine was a professor of rhetoric. He wanted to listen to this person preach and compare notes, for example. Eventually, as he listened to the theological content of the sermons, he started to realize that the answers were present, or the answers to his concerns about Manichaeism. For example, one of them had to do with what might be considered a very literal reading of the scriptures. Ambrose presented a more allegorical reading, and that really influenced Augustine. In addition to the allegorical aspect, Augustine really benefited from this new understanding of evil as non-being. I mentioned how for Manichaeus, it was a highly dualistic ontology, the good god of light versus the evil god of darkness. The immaterial is good, the material is bad. And Augustine really struggled with how to resolve this issue over evil. The Neoplatonists provided him with the concepts and the language to talk about evil as non-being. Evil is no longer its own substance, opposed to God. Evil is a lack of good. Evil is that which is opposed to God. He uses very similar terms that much later C.S. Lewis would use. Evil, kind of bent good, if you will. So that was really crucial in his conversion as well. I mentioned a moment ago how Augustine was passionate about the pursuit of wisdom. He was passionate about philosophy. He really appreciated the Manichees for how they promised wisdom apart from faith. And he wanted to retain that, but he wasn't sure how. And so with Ambrose, he was able to answer both of those questions. Part of the reason is that Ambrose, to some degree like Augustine, was classically trained. Ambrose was born into a wealthy family. He was raised in classics, Greek and Latin. In fact, he knew Cicero better than he knew the Bible. So
Wow.
Ambrose was really someone who could speak Augustine's own language, so to speak, of the intellectual, but he also gave Augustine really the first opportunity to see how Christianity and philosophy and reason could be blended together. And as you say, that's pivotal. That becomes fundamental to Augustine. That becomes fundamental to the development of Christianity and philosophy and theology in the West for centuries afterwards.
So when we look at the work itself, I want to take a look at some of the key themes in the work itself. And one of the most famous lines is, quote, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you," end quote. How does this encapsulate the theme of restlessness and the human search for meaning?
Such a wonderful phrase, and also a very famous one. At the very end of the first paragraph of book one, I mentioned a moment ago the idea of God pursuing the soul. That, I think, is central. It also invokes the idea of creation. Of course, later in the Confessions, Augustine provides an exegesis of Genesis, talks about creation in very, let's say, profound, creative, philosophical ways. When it comes to what it means to be human, for example, the classical world was preoccupied, not surprisingly, with that in which the good life consists. How can we be truly happy? A traditional Socratic question. And one could talk about the good, virtue of the good life very clearly. And Augustine, in a sense, is innovation, I think, is to say that the good life cannot be attained in this world, that we are constantly on this journey, this pilgrimage to God. So to say that we have been made for God is to say that, and Augustine argues this, that we do not have our own, so to speak, human nature, which is very radical. And certainly the classical world wants to talk about what it means to be human. Augustine does too, but he says we cannot understand a human being apart from God. That's just not possible. And I've written about this elsewhere. I think that most people could read that from a Christian perspective and say, yes, that makes sense. That's very interesting. And what I want to suggest is, no, that's actually very radical and very challenging. We have no identity apart from God. We certainly do not exist in the sense of creation, but to the extent that we move away from God, we cease to exist. This, again, I think is very Platonic, Neoplatonic, that the farther we move away from God, whether it's through sin, selfishness, what have you, the greater we move towards non-being. And so we don't become ourselves without God. I think that's really central to his work. And in a sense, that opening paragraph really sets the agenda for everything else that comes afterwards. That, as I mentioned, the Confessions is the story of soul, the story of God's interaction with Augustine's soul. God is pulling him towards him, but through this, Augustine is becoming most himself. I think that's really the best way to interpret it, to realize that to be a human being in general, and for Augustine to be Augustine, he needs to be drawn by God and eventually surrender himself to God and his greatness and his grace.
So when we look at book 2, there's an incident with a pear tree that's often highlighted as a symbol of sin. What does this reveal about Augustine's understanding of evil, free will, and human nature?
Yes, this is, as you say, a very famous incident, one which I think in many ways is misunderstood or superficially understood. Augustine, and what I like about the anecdote as well is that I think it's probably very relatable. Augustine, as an adolescent, is home from his studies, and this was a time when he had to interrupt his studies because his father did not have the resources to pay his fees. So he's at home, and he's out with his friends and perhaps getting into mischief. They find a pear tree as they're walking along, and so they take these pears from the tree, and they're just getting into mischief. They're throwing the pears at each other, um, adolescent mischief.
Sure.
Not good, but certainly not something that would seem to warrant an extensive comment. Augustine, it seems, is making a deeper point. One of the things that he writes is that they had no interest in the pears for food. It's not like they were hungry or they just felt like having pears or they liked the taste of pears. They simply wanted to create chaos. They simply wanted to do it because it was bad, because it was the wrong thing. And you might say, well, that's just how adolescents are. Just people be silly. Augustine, though, says there's something deeper here, and he repoints at it. And it's disturbing for him at an intellectual level because he says, I encountered within myself this great void. Remember, he talks about evil as non-being. So it does not make sense to him intellectually to talk about doing something evil for the sake of evil. Certainly we can do things that are wrong, but at least at some minimal level, we have a good purpose for them. Augustine, moving away from Manichaeism, would eventually say, sin is not so much doing something evil, it's doing something less good. Certainly it's still evil, but I think
Yeah.
that that's a more nuanced way of interpreting it. And so when he sees this capacity for evil within himself and within others, this is really shocking to him. And
Mm.
I think one of the things that resonates about that is if you want to think on a grand scale, think about the capacity for human evil. What is it about us that can give into it so easily? And that's within us.
Yeah.
That's disturbing. That's within every human being simply in virtue of being human. That's really concerning. Similarly, and this is related to what I mentioned a moment ago, Augustine states that he would not have participated were it not for his friends. In other words,
Mm.
he gave an
That's interesting because he's kind of removing his own agency in a lot of ways.
well, I think that's true, although I think that he would still accept responsibility for it. But
Hmm.
on the topic of agency, I think what his real point is to say, what is it about me that leads me to do things that I would not have done on my own? So I think in a way it is also an indictment, yes, of himself, but also of human nature. Once again, if we want to think historically, I think we could probably think of plenty of examples of situations in which people find themselves doing things that are wrong that they may not have done otherwise. And I'm just thinking out loud, I wonder if it's a coincidence that Hannah Arendt wrote her PhD on Augustine. I'm sure others have talked about that, but it just was on
Well,
my.
I think it's interesting because sometimes we get in situations where necessity requires us to do certain things, and those things, I guess, might not always be right. I know recently I've been reading a lot about the life of Catherine the Great, Catherine the Great of Russia, and there's a lot of things that she
Mm,
had this idea that she wanted serfs to have more freedom. She wanted
mm.
the political class to stop oppressing them, but at the same time, she continues to keep that happening because she has to keep the political system together. So I think oftentimes people do things out of necessity.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's where perhaps the misreading of Augustine or the kind of dismissiveness towards
Sure.
Augustine comes, because what you just described, I think Augustine, I think that's at the root of this point, that if we want to think about evil, it's actually more complicated. But
Hmm.
what about that situation where you just do evil for the sake of evil?
Right.
That's very strange. And yes, it could just be mischief on the surface, but I think his question is, what is it about me as an individual that can give into that? And what about when it's not just someone's pear tree? What if it's another situation? That capacity remains. I think that really, let's say, disturbs him at this deep existential level.
Sure. And one of the major themes of the work is the idea of grace. And I guess when we look at the way Augustine emphasizes that can yeah, I'm going to give that to you again. When we look at the way that Augustine emphasizes that conversion is ultimately God's work, not just human work, how does this contrast with his self-reliant philosophy of his era? And what does this tell modern readers?
Also, I think really fascinating questions, and which intersect, as you stated, with his time and with our time. Perhaps I'll go backwards,
Sure.
anachronistically. One of the things that scholars have really found interesting about Augustine is the heteronomy of his thought. In other words, the opposite of autonomy, that I am not purely in control of myself. In response to, let's say, the modern project, the Enlightenment project, broadly speaking, Augustine has been invoked as someone who suggests that this idea of autonomy is, forget about whether it's good or bad, it's just not realistic. It's just not descriptively correct. And if you want to de-theologize it, you might put it in terms of, let's say, the way in which people are raised in traditions, the way in which people are always part of webs of relationships, whatever you want to say about it. I think that Augustine's thought really challenges a kind of unreflective
Mm.
individualism. So I definitely think that's true. Of course, heteronomy, being ruled by something else, can seem very disturbing and perhaps even unhuman or subhuman. That's why what we mentioned a moment ago about finding our rest in God, finding our fulfillment in God, I think is so important. This is something I also discuss in my book, which I think requires some nuance. the terms that we use now between autonomy, heteronomy, am I making this authentic decision for myself or am I being influenced by others? These kinds of questions or categories would not have made sense, I think, to Augustine or his time. I think that
Sure.
that would have been a very difficult conversation for him to have. All that being said, in terms of the self-reliance of that time, I think certainly the importance of grace is controversial, even within Christianity. Of course, decades later, there was the Pelagian controversy, the semi-Pelagians. So even people within Christianity itself have a concern with things like the doctrine of grace and reliance on God, because they might say, where's the place for personal responsibility? Or looking at it in terms of human nature, are we really so corrupted by sin, or have we simply strayed from God and we need to get back and we need some help for that? But this idea of this completely vitiated human nature, that's a little bit too far for people like Pelagius. And then so going off on a, not that I'll go off on the tangent, but then it's really interesting how Augustine reemerges as really the Protestant church father during the Reformation. But anyway, to return to your point, I would
Yeah.
say that the doctrine of grace is possibly original. I'd have to think more about that, but definitely very revolutionary, even
Hmm.
within Christianity itself. And as the church continues, the doctrine of grace is still controversial. So I think Augustine introduces both within Christianity and within the ancient world this really surprising idea of how we are not under our own complete control.
Hmm.
This, I think, is why in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Freud and Augustine were also placed together. Because, of course, at some level, Freud wants to say that our urges, our desires, our interests, these are largely formed apart from our own control. There's a good book on this by someone named William Parsons, 2013, Freud and Augustine in Dialogue. Some of the early scholarship really goes down this rabbit hole of Oedipal tendencies and such, and I think many people would find that extreme. But I think the deeper question is, what is it really at the heart of us that's driving us, especially if so much of it is beyond our conscious access?
Well, I want to look at kind of the rhetorical world that Augustine lived in. You know, the rhetoric had been a big Roman tradition in the way they communicated and the way they thought about things. What influence did rhetoric and the rhetorical style have on Augustine?
Also, really crucial, especially because that was Augustine's entire life. In the Confessions in particular, I think that one starts to see, to invoke once again the word pivotal, that pivot away from rhetoric to a critical view of it, to put it in general terms. Augustine initially, obviously, was very influenced by rhetoric, by the classical tradition. Eloquence was crucial for him, whether spoken or written.
Hmm.
Eventually, he changes, but that initial acceptance of rhetoric and its principles was one of the reasons that he resisted Christianity. He
Mm.
read the Bible and he said, this is simplistic. There's no elevated style. This is nothing compared to Cicero or Virgil. I mean, this is inadequate. Surely God, who is so great, could not countenance allowing this to be his word. So he looked down upon it, and he talks about this later as a sort of pridefulness. So slowly but surely, he begins to reject some of his rhetorical training. However, that being said, he does not completely jettison that initially. I think what he starts to see is how the this I also think returns to what we were just discussing, how this pursuit of truth through rhetoric or through philosophy can be at the service of God, at the service of truth, and at the service of wisdom. But if we do not have that order correct, then we have the opportunity or the risk of, let's say, turning in on ourselves, of collapsing on ourselves. One of the famous scenes of the Confessions is when he is in Milan and he is commissioned to deliver a speech to the emperor. This is at the height of his career. He's really at the point of making it. And he's miserable. He's wandering the streets and he's worried because, as you know, as a scholar of ancient Rome, these um, these speeches were lacking in truth,
Hmm.
generally speaking, to put it mildly. And he has this crisis of conscience because he does not want to violate his integrity. But at the same time, this is the emperor. What is
Yeah.
he supposed to do? And he crosses paths with a man who is intoxicated and apparently unhoused. And it occurs to him, this man is happier than I am. He has nothing to his name. I mean, he has no career, he has no home, nothing, but he's content. Look, he's jolly, he's happy. And of course, Augustine says this isn't true happiness, but his point is to say that even this person is in a better state than I am. And this is one of those crucial situations in which he starts to distance himself from his career aspirations, from the ideals of philosophy and rhetoric and attaining high positions. This is one of those really crucial moments that really gets him to reflect. And as I mentioned with Monica, that's why her figure is so symbolic and important. He talks about her in another place, couple of places. He talks about how there are, so to speak, two ways to wisdom. Not necessarily mutually exclusive, but usually, in fact, they are. One of them is the way of philosophy, but the risk, as I mentioned, is that intellectual arrogance. The other is through a simple, humble faith. And he says Monica, his mother, was the perfect exemplar of that, that it was through this purity, this humility, this way in which she removed all self-conceit from her heart, that the wisdom of God was able to shine clearly. So rhetoric remained really complicated reality, not just for him, but really for all ancient Christians, as you know. I mean, people like Ambrose, people like Cyril of Alexandria, and you select any ancient Christian author you'd like, they have this really ambivalent relationship with, for lack of a better term, Greek and Roman learning. It's really complicated. And for Augustine, it is as well. I'll just add this other anecdote by way of conclusion. Augustine talks about how, as a young man, when he was learning grammar and rhetoric, he chides himself because he would be horrified if he, so to speak, butchered a word, if he pronounced something incorrectly, or he committed some sort of grammatical error. Whereas if, and perhaps this is exaggerated, but he would have no problem if someone, quote unquote, butchered another human being. He's being a
Wow.
little bit facetious, but his point is to say, I was so consumed with these rules that I lost my humanity as a
Mhm.
result of it. So
Wow.
rhetoric is this crucial. It's crucial to him as an individual. It's complex, but then of course, remember he becomes a bishop,
Yeah.
so he's preaching all the time. So he's definitely employing those rhetorical skills still. So I think it's one of those issues with which he's constantly wrestling throughout his life. Although I will say later in his life, his language, his way of addressing the people becomes quote unquote simpler, in part just out of practical necessity because his audience is largely uneducated. What is
Sure.
interesting, some of his earlier sermons, are more elevated and such. And the impression I have, at least, is that it was, I speak from some experience here, it was like a freshly minted PhD trying to give a lecture to freshmen, core students. They just have they're just painfully bored, So
Yeah.
sometimes I think that perhaps that's how Augustine felt when he was trying to uh, address his congregation, that they were just there was just not a connection there. So we had to reconceive of things. But yes, rhetoric is really a fascinating topic, and one which I would say, even theologically, is probably understudied.
Well, Dr. Knotts, two final things for you before we wrap up here. The first is I'd like to take a look at, for people that might be new to the work of Augustine, or might be new to reading the Confessions, what advice would you give them, and how to look at the work? And also at the same time, are there any resources they should seek out to, help them with getting through this?
Yes, I would say when I encountered it, granted, when I encountered it, I was studying philosophy and theology, so it was a little bit easier for me. I would say there are plenty of good translations of the work, so I would not be too concerned about selecting the right translation. One suggestion may be to find one that has perhaps more critical material, footnotes, but I don't think that's extremely necessary. I think
Hmm.
keeping in mind what I mentioned a little while ago about how it's ultimately a prayer is very important. If one goes into it, thinking of it as a memoir, an autobiography, one may appreciate it, but not really grasp its full significance. So I would say enter it with that in mind. Find a decent English translation, especially one with annotations or footnotes, and not to sound too romantic, but really just open oneself to the experience.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating. It's also the sort of thing that rewards careful reading and frequent reading. So I would say for those who are interested, it might be one of those things that becomes a sort of companion book, something that one returns to over and over again.
Sure. It's funny. I It's not from a spiritual perspective, but I have books that I do read every year because I get new insight on them.
Really
And one of them is Machiavelli's Prince, and
nice.
mainly because I'm just so interested in Cesare Borgia. But I think you do get new perspective when you read things, when different things are occurring in your life or different things are happening in the world around you. So I think that is really sound advice.
Yes.
So for people that want to find out more about you, or they want to check out more of your work, I know you are constantly writing. How can they find out more about you, or how can they connect with you?
Certainly. Well, I'm on LinkedIn and academia, Matthew W. Knotts on LinkedIn. And if you search for me on academia, you'll find me there. If you look at bloomsbury.com, search my name, you'll find my two books. I also have a book under contract now with another publisher. I will be on education and late antiquity. So, especially those two platforms, you'll find not just my books, but other publications of mine. This year, I've published a few things. I just had something appear with a university press in Spain, Murcia, on blindness in late antiquity. So Augustine's interpretation of the man born blind and how that fits into the aspects of how blindness was addressed as a reality. I also published a couple of things on philosophy and reflection. So I have a piece in a recent work on Emmanuel Falk, the French philosopher, that's with Whitman Stock. And then I have an article as well on Ignatius and Foucault, that's with a um, French academic journal, uh, Cahiers d'études religieuses, recherche interdisciplinaire, or CERRI for short. So that if one is inclined, I'd be grateful for some readers and responders.
Very cool. Well, Dr. Knotts, I really appreciate you taking some time out today to chat with us. And for those of you that are new to the Athenium Book Club, don't forget to check out atheniumbooks.com. Also, if you're watching the video version of this, we are now freshly on YouTube, so don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and also subscribe. If you're listening to the podcast version, the audio is available everywhere, and we've been hitting the charts recently, which is great as well. So make sure you subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever else you're listening. And thank you for hanging out, and we'll catch you guys next time.